Now let's go over the classification of different eukaryotic groups. At one point, eukaryotes were classified into 4 different kingdoms. So remember that kingdom is the level of hierarchical classification that normally comes just below domain. And those 4 kingdoms were the protists, the plants, the animals, and the fungi. Scientists have now rejected that classification system. Okay, they've decided that the protists are too diverse to be considered to be within one kingdom. And as we'll see in a moment, the protists are also not a monophyletic group. Okay, so one of the problems facing taxonomists that are trying to classify the different eukaryotic groups is that we're not yet sure which of these groups should be considered to be separate kingdoms. Another problem that taxonomists face is determining where to root the phylogenetic tree that contains the eukaryotes. Okay, remember that the root of a tree is the branch of that tree that was the first to diverge from all of the other branches. At one point in time, it was thought that a group of protists that lacked mitochondria, appropriately named the amitochondriates, was the first branch to diverge from the other eukaryotes. It was thought that the absence of a mitochondrion meant that they diverged from the other groups before endosymbiotic bacteria became the first mitochondria. And it was thought that these cells went through the process of enclosing the DNA into a nucleus, but not of gaining those endosymbiont bacteria that eventually became the first mitochondria. Okay, DNA evidence and closer morphological examination of these cells have shown that that hypothesis is not correct. It actually turns out that the organisms that were thought to lack mitochondria are polyphyletic. They're found in many different taxonomic groups, and they have ancestors more closely related to them with mitochondria than the other groups without mitochondria. Okay, so these amitochondriates have close relatives with mitochondria and distant relatives without mitochondria. Okay, another problem with the previous theory that the absence of mitochondria was an indication that the root of the tree should contain the amitochondriates is that many of these species previously classified as lacking the mitochondria actually have very small or very reduced mitochondria. So it's thought that that endosymbiotic event happened in the ancestors of these organisms, and that the mitochondria shrank, or in some cases disappeared altogether, based on the metabolic needs of the cell. Okay, remember that mitochondria are involved in manufacturing ATP and giving the cell energy, but that smaller amounts of ATP can be manufactured during the first step of respiration, glycolysis. The mitochondria are not involved in that step. So our understanding of how the different groups of protists are related continues to change rapidly. But the hypothesis that we'll present in this course, which is currently the most well-supported hypothesis that the largest number of scientists agree upon is to divide all of the eukaryotes into 4 different supergroups. Okay, so these supergroups probably contain several kingdoms, and scientists aren't sure yet which groups within the supergroups to classify as separate kingdoms. Now, this is not to say that all scientists agree upon these 4 supergroups. Certainly, one of the things that scientists are most likely to disagree upon is how to classify different organisms. So now let's take a look at a proposed phylogeny that illustrates these 4 different supergroups. Okay, we have the excavata, which is a group of protists that contains 3 other groups. We have another group simply called the SAR clade. Okay, and SAR stands for the first letter of each of the 3 groups within the clade. So the excavata and the SAR clade contain only organisms that could generally be described as protists. Okay, remember that most protists are unicellular, a few are multicellular, and the protists that are multicellular can be distinguished from the fungi, the plants, and the animals because their amount of cellular specialization is less than those other 3 groups. Okay, the next of the 4 supergroups is the Archaeoplastida. Okay, that includes not only several different types of algae, but also the land plants. Okay, so the algae, the red algae and the green algae, are considered protists, and of course the land plants are found in their own kingdom. Now keep in mind that algae is also not a monophyletic group. The brown algae are actually found in the SAR clade and are not at all closely related to either the red algae or the green algae. And finally, the 4th of these 4 supergroups is the Uniconta. Okay, the Uniconta contains several groups of protists, as well as the fungi and the animals. Okay, so look at the distribution of kingdoms within this classification system. The land plants, the fungi, and the animals are all separate kingdoms. So it's pretty obvious that the classification of protists, which are represented by everything else outside of those 3 kingdoms, certainly contains several different kingdoms. The best classification system, based on monophyletic groups and similar amounts of genetic diversity within each kingdom, would certainly separate the protists into many different kingdoms, and not just one, as has formerly been the case. Okay, so now it's time to go over these 4 different supergroups. Okay, remember that supergroup is sort of an informal classification of these clusters of kingdoms. And this part of our lecture will highlight the amazing structural and ecological diversity of the different eukaryotes, particularly the different types of protists. Now, I certainly don't expect you to remember every single name that we're going to go over within these 4 different supergroups. But you should be familiar with the 4 supergroups and with some of the concepts that we'll be learning in this part of the lecture. For example, we'll be reviewing the concept of what a monophyletic group is in this portion of the lecture. You also should be familiar with any of the organisms that we go over in lab. If we look at the organism in the lab and we talk about it in the lecture, the probability that you'll be tested on the traits of that organism is very high. You should also be familiar with groups of protists that illustrate something very special. Okay, like the groups that were involved in the evolution of multicellularity, or the group that's the most closely related to the animals or to the fungi. Okay, so the first supergroup that we'll talk about is called the excavata. And the trait that distinguishes this group from the other groups of protists is the structure of its cytoskeleton. Okay, remember the cytoskeleton is that array of microtubules within an organism's cell that are involved in the structure and the movement of the organism. And this complex cytoskeleton also causes a number of members of excavata to have deep grooves in their surface. And that's where the name excavata comes from. It looks like these grooves have been excavated out of the sides of the organism's surface. So scientists generally agree that the group excavata is monophyletic, and it contains three other groups: the diplomonads, the parabasalids, and the euglenozoans. Okay, the diplomonads and the parabasalids are groups that lack plastids and have very small or very reduced mitochondria. So as you might expect, most live in anaerobic environments. Okay, think for a minute about why this makes sense. Okay, so the answer that you should have come up with is that mitochondria require oxygen for respiration. So if you were an anaerobic organism and you underwent only anaerobic respiration, you would have no need for mitochondria. And an interesting example that's very well studied and important in this group is the organism that causes Giardia. Okay, the protist pictured here causes this disease, which is a digestive disorder that causes a lot of intestinal distress, and it often comes from travelers who are drinking contaminated water. Okay, these organisms, the diplomonads, move by using flagella, and we'll see that flagella are a trait that is dispersed throughout many different unrelated taxonomic groups. The parabasalids is another very interesting group. They also have reduced mitochondria, and some of the energy that they produce is anaerobic. They tend to have a very interesting and funny shape, and one species is known to cause a sexually transmitted disease in humans. So keep in mind that not all diseases are caused by bacteria and viruses. There are lots of examples spread throughout the protists that are also involved in causing diseases both in humans and in a number of plants and animals. Also within the excavata is a group called the euglenozoa. Okay, so this includes some organisms that you're familiar with. This includes some organisms that you may be familiar with and that we'll also be observing in the lab. Okay, the euglenids are an interesting group of organisms that carry out both photosynthesis, and they also consume other organisms, making them both heterotrophs and autotrophs. And so we could describe them as mixotrophs. That's a term that describes organisms that are both autotrophic and heterotrophic. Another group within the euglenids is called the kinetoplastids. Okay, the kinetoplastids have a very strange shape. These funny squiggly things here are the kinetoplastids that cause a disease called sleeping sickness. Although a number of kinetoplastids are also free-living and harmless. Kinetoplastids have a single very large mitochondrion with a very extensive organized mass of DNA. Okay, so now we move on to the second supergroup. The second supergroup has a very simple name. It's simply known as the SAR clade. Okay, remember that a clade is a group that's monophyletic based on the shared derived characters of the organisms that are contained within it. So together, three smaller groups, the straminophiles, the alveolates, and the rhizarians, make up the SAR clade. And scientists haven't determined yet whether to classify straminophiles, alveolates, and rhizarians as separate kingdoms, whether to put the whole SAR clade together in one kingdom, or to make even finer distinctions when determining the kingdoms. Okay, so the straminophiles include both the diatoms and the brown algae. Okay, so these groups are some of the most important photosynthetic organisms on Earth. Okay, and this photosynthesis provides the basis for the marine food chains. Okay, the diatoms have a particularly interesting structure. They come in lots of different shapes, and they have a very intricate outer shell that's very glass-like. Okay, it's made of essentially the same substance as the glass that we humans use, and it helps to protect the organism, and it's extremely strong, okay, protecting the organism from predators. Now, diatoms are also economically important. The shells that these organisms leave behind after they die have historically been used in making a lot of different industrial chemicals, including something that you use every day, toothpaste. The brown algae are the largest and most complex algae, as well as the largest protists. All types of brown algae are multicellular, and the majority of them are found in marine environments. Okay, they include many groups that people would call seaweeds, although the true seaweeds, including the types that we eat, are actually red algae. Okay, so the brown algae have a number of structures that function very similar to plants. The structures called the holdfasts actually attach or anchor the algae to the substance that they need to remain attached to. The stipe is a long tube, very similar to the stem of a plant or the trunk of a tree. And the blades are leaf-like structures involved in photosynthesis. Even though these structures are functionally very similar to structures in plants, brown algae and plants are not at all closely related. They're actually found in different supergroups. So any structural similarities that we see between these groups are due to convergent evolution. Okay, so that means we would consider them to be analogous structures, not homologous structures. The next group within the SAR clades is the alveolates. Okay, and they're known for a specific type of membrane-bound sac found beneath the plasma membrane. Okay, and it's named after the alveoli, which are the air-filled sacs in our lungs that assist with breathing. And the two primary groups within the alveolates are the dinoflagellates and the ciliates. Okay, dinoflagellates are a group that move around by using two different flagella. Okay, so remember those are the whip-like structures that are involved in movement. The dinoflagellates also have a very tough outer structure made out of cellulose. They're extremely abundant in both marine and freshwater environments. Like the euglenas, they have the ability to both carry out photosynthesis, okay, even though they're typically not green, they're very often, okay, they're more commonly red, but remember that there are some red, orange, and yellow pigments that are also involved in photosynthesis, in addition to chlorophyll, the pigment that we're the most familiar with. Okay, they also have the ability to eat other organisms. And remember that organisms that are both autotrophs and heterotrophs are called mixotrophs. These dinoflagellates also have important significance to humans. Occasionally, under certain circumstances, these organisms grow to extremely high abundances in marine environments. Okay, and the red pigment in these dinoflagellates causes the water to turn red, and we call this a red tide. Okay, and during a red tide, no one should swim in that water, and for some time after a red tide, any shellfish in the area, like oysters or clams, should not be eaten by humans. Okay, if humans eat shellfish that are contaminated by dinoflagellates, they can become very sick because of a toxin that's released by the dinoflagellate. Okay, so now we get to one of my favorite groups, the ciliates. Okay, the ciliates are a very large and diverse group of protists that are named after the way that they move. Okay, they use the cilia, which are tiny little hairs that beat together in unison in order to move throughout the water. So the didymium and the paramecium that you saw at the beginning of this chapter are ciliates, and so are many organisms that you've probably looked at under a microscope in other biology classes. Okay, these organisms can be predators. Sometimes they eat other protists. Other times they feed on small bacteria. And some, like this ice cream cone-shaped creature here, known as stentor, also have the ability to obtain photosynthetic energy. They come in all different shapes and sizes. Many ciliates are visible to the naked eye. Okay, they can be quite large, and many of them have funny ways of moving. This interesting bell-shaped organism here on a stalk is called Vorticella. Okay, so the final group within the SAR clade is called the rhizarians. Okay, so the rhizarians include a number of organisms that could be classified as amoebas. Okay, amoebas are organisms that move and obtain their food by extending flexible portions of the cytoplasm called pseudopodia. And we'll be able to get to see an amoeba move in the lab this week. You may have seen this before, though, in other biology classes. There are also a group called foraminifera, often abbreviated forams. Okay, these are a little bit similar to diatoms because they have a very intricate and very hard outer shell. But this shell is, instead of being made out of a glass-like material, has a high percentage of calcium carbonate. Some of the shells of foraminifera are shown here, illustrating the interesting structural diversity found within the foraminifera. The deposition of large numbers of these shells from foraminifera that have died over millions of years have formed this breathtaking landscape here known as the White Cliffs of Dover. And they have important significance for scientists studying the Earth's climate. Okay, scientists can take cores of these and look at climate change across millions of years by examining the chemical content of the shells of the foraminiferans. I also wanted to include a picture of this creature here that's recently been determined to be a close relative of the foraminiferans. This thing is called the xenophyophore. Okay, it's a unicellular deep-sea organism that's been determined to be the largest unicellular organism discovered so far. Okay, the largest individuals of these xenophyophores have been measured at 20 centimeters in length, so that's about 8 inches. Now that's a really big cell. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of protists are fairly large, okay? Very large compared to the cells found in multicellular organisms or to the cells of prokaryotes. Okay, the reason that most cells are so small is that being small makes it easy for cells to import and export materials and waste products. A small cell doesn't have very far to move these materials. So a larger protist has to expend a lot of energy moving materials around the cell. For many unicellular protists, it's worth the extra energy to try and be larger than other organisms that may feed upon you. Okay? Being large also helps to increase the types of prey items that the organism can feed upon. But this xenophyophore, which looks a lot like a head of lettuce, solves the problem of transporting nutrients inside of it and exporting waste products by its unusual shape. Because it has these flat and wavy extensions, it's never very far from the water around it to the center of the organism. So these organisms, which move around very little, can obtain food by filtering food particles out of the water column and have no trouble exporting wastes. So as I mentioned, amoebas are included within the SAR clade, but amoebas are also found within some of the other different supergroups. Okay, so amoeba is a useful classification for describing how an organism moves with those extensions of the cytoplasm and the very flexible cell membrane that has no cell wall or any other rigid structure. The rhizarian group, known as cercozoans, contains many amoebas. And so does this unicont group, known as the amoebozoans, and the nuclearids, which are also found within the uniconts, but not closely related to the aminozoans. Okay, so we would say that the amoebas are what type of group? Okay, you're correct if you said polyphyletic. And what process would you say that the amoeboid type of motion has evolved through? Okay, if you said convergent evolution, or that the amoeboid motion is an analogous trait, you'd be correct. Okay, so now we arrive at the third of the four supergroups within the eukaryotes, called the archaeplastids. Okay, and this is a group that arose when heterotrophic protists that already had those mitochondria and were already eukaryotic acquired a plastid by serving as a host to a cyanobacterial endosymbiont that eventually became either a chloroplast or one of the other types of plastids like chromoplasts. Okay, so all organisms within the archaeplastids have some ability to photosynthesize. Okay, the red algae and the green algae are the two primary groups, and the land plants are most closely related to the green algae and also occur within the archaeplastids. Okay, now let's talk about the red algae. Okay, in addition to chlorophyll, they also have a red photosynthetic pigment. Okay, this pigment is called phycoerythrin, and the mixture of this pigment and the green chlorophyll gives these organisms kind of a reddish or maroon coloration. Okay, and the amount of this pigment relative to chlorophyll causes the exact coloration of these organisms. Most members of red algae are multicellular, and the organisms that we call seaweed, including all of the edible seaweeds, are included within the red algae group. And sexual reproduction, which evolved independently several times, is one of the complex characteristics of the red algae. Okay, the green algae are the sister group to the red algae. And in green algae, as you might expect, chlorophyll is the dominant photosynthetic pigment. Plants are descended from this lineage. Okay, the two main groups are the charophytes and the chlorophytes. The chlorophytes include several unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. Okay, Chlamydomonas, pictured in the center here, that we've already seen as we discussed the evolution of multicellularity in Volvox, is included within the chlorophytes. And so is this interesting species here called Spirogyra. Okay, in addition to being the name of a rock band, Spirogyra is an organism that contains these interesting spiral-shaped chloroplasts. The charophytes are multicellular and complex green algae that are most closely related to the plants that invaded land. And an example of a charophyte is pictured here on the right. These chlorophytes can live in both marine and freshwater, and even a few groups have become terrestrial. Okay. Most of these relatively complex protists reproduce sexually. Okay, the unicellular chlorophytes can either be free-living. Remember that free-floating unicellular photosynthetic organisms form the plankton that's at the base of many food chains. and other species have formed a symbiotic relationship within other eukaryotes. Okay, so let's quiz you for a moment here. What's this process called when a eukaryotic organism enters another eukaryotic organism and develops a symbiotic relationship? Okay, you should have said secondary endosymbiosis, okay, because primary endosymbiosis occurred when a prokaryote invaded another prokaryotic cell. If a eukaryote invades a eukaryotic cell, that's secondary endosymbiosis. Two of the groups of chlorophytes contain particularly large and complex organisms. Okay, so ulva, the large multicellular sea lettuce, and volvox, the species that we've already discussed the evolution of multicellularity in, are two of the most complex groups. Okay, so finally we now arrive at the fourth supergroup, the uniconts, okay, or uniconta. This group includes the animals, the fungi, as well as many different types of protists. Again, illustrating the important point that the group protist is polyphyletic. Okay, so the two main clades within the uniconts are the amoebozoans and the opisthokonts. Okay, the opisthokonts includes animals, fungi, and some related protists. Okay, so clearly the uniconts contain more than one kingdom if animals and fungi are each considered to be their own kingdom. Scientists have debated where to put uniconts on the eukaryotic tree. Some scientists think that the unicont lineage was the first group to separate from all of the other eukaryotes. Okay, so what would be the special name for that lineage that's the first to diverge from the other groups? Okay, that would be the root. Okay, so if we knew that this was true, we could root the eukaryotic tree. But other scientists disagree from that and think that the uniconts diverged fairly late from the other groups. Okay, so the amoebozoans, one of the two groups, okay, one of the two primary clades within the uniconts include amoebas. Okay, so remember that amoebas are polyphyletic, since we also have them in the rhizarians and some other unrelated groups. Some of these amoebas can be free-living, and others are parasites. And the amoebozoans also include this colonial organism here known as a slime mold. So slime molds are one of the most fascinating types of protists. They can act as unicellular solitary cells, or they can behave as a colonial organism. So unlike some other types of colonial organisms, the cells are perfectly capable of surviving on their own in isolation. But at other times, they get together with other cells and move along as an amoeba-like structure. These solitary cells could be classified as amoebas because of their way of motion. At other times, they group together with other individuals of the same species and move along as a large structure called a slug. They're capable of either sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction, depending upon the needs of the environment. Okay, remember that often, when conditions are stressful, Sexual reproduction is advantageous because it produces so many different types of offspring. That gives a population a greater chance of producing a few individuals in the next generation that'll have traits needed to survive in the new environment. Asexual reproduction occurs after the formation of some structures that are very similar to the structures in fungi. The group of amoebas moving together eventually forms a stalk by the cells piling upon one another and forming this large globe at the top called a fruiting body. Then the fruiting body produces spores that are very resistant to drying out. Okay, so if the organism encounters a particular type of stressful environment, a very dry environment, producing spores that are easily swept by the wind and can easily survive drying out might be the best way to go. Whereas other types of stressful environments, sexual reproduction might be the way to go. The slime molds were originally thought to be closely related to fungi because their role in the environment as decomposers in their production of spores through a stalk and a fruiting body is very similar to the way that fungi reproduce. However, after examining the cellular structure of individual slime mold cells and looking at DNA evidence, we now see that the ecological role of slime molds, as well as the reproductive production of spores, are traits that arose independently. Okay, the other of the two clades within the uniconts contains a diverse group of organisms, including the animals, all different types, vertebrates and invertebrates, the fungi, which are both unicellular and multicellular, and several groups of protists. Okay. Remember that the chonoflagellates, the colonial group pictured here, is the group most closely related to the animals, and that was determined by the cellular similarity of chonoflagellates and sponges. Within the opisthecons, we also see yet another amoeba. Okay, the nuclearids, pictured here, also have amoeba-like movement, even though the structure within the pseudopods is somewhat different.